Okay, I just wanted to give a couple of minutes for people to join us. And thank you so much for joining us. And you're very welcome to this first of our spring webinar series on finding financial aid. We are so thrilled to have Bryce Benton here from Denison University. And before we get started, I'm just going to say a little bit about who we are and also introduce myself. So my name is Sarah Norman. I am the Advising and Events Manager at the US-UK Fulbright Commission. You can probably tell by my accent that I myself am American. I'm originally from Texas, where I also attended university. I had the amazing opportunity to study abroad twice as an undergrad, and I also went abroad for my master's degree. So I can't recommend the experience highly enough. It really is a transformative process to study abroad. So I applaud all of you for considering the idea. And I'm very happy to just have you join us to learn a bit more about studying in the US and in particular about finding financial aid. So before we get started, I just want to touch on a few logistical points. Please be sure throughout the webinar to mute your microphone. We will take questions at the end, so I'll be moderating a Q&A section. There is a little Q&A box you'll see on the Zoom platform, so you can write your questions in there. However, we do ask that you hold all questions till the end because it can be that your questions will be answered in the presentation. However, if you have any technical issues, if your audio is not working or you're having any problems like that, you can use the Q&A throughout the presentation, and I'll do my best to try and help you. This webinar will also be recorded and sent within a few days, so just be aware of that, that you'll have that for notes or a resource if you need that. Okay. Okay, so who are we? So we're the US-UK Fulbright Commission. We were started in the aftermath of World War II by Senator Fulbright. And Senator Fulbright thought that the best way to avoid a third war would be to promote peace through educational and cultural exchange. So that gave birth to the Fulbright Commission, which is basically a partnership between the US and UK governments. It's jointly funded to promote that peace through cultural and educational exchange. So that's who we are. We are also a nonprofit organization, and there are commissions all over the world. And under that, at Fulbright, we have Education USA. So these are advisory service at Fulbright, and our whole mission is to offer free, unbiased advice to help specifically UK students applying to the US. This is a US Department of State network, so we're a part of an amazing network all over the world that shares this similar mission. So basically our job is to help you get to the US if that's what you want to do. So if it's your dream to study in the US, do use our resources. We are here to be a resource for you. And we have a helpline and an advising inbox to help with any questions that you have, as well as an undergraduate guide to US study on our Fulbright website. So do check out those resources. Okay, so that's enough from me. So now I'm going to hand it over to Bryce. So Bryce is currently the Associate Director of Admission at Denison University in Granville, Ohio. He has over 8 years of experience working in admission and financial aid for different US institutions. And in his current role, he oversees the admission and financial aid for all international applicants to Denison. I can personally attest that Bryce is very knowledgeable about financial aid, so we're very happy to welcome him to present this very popular topic. So you're very welcome, Bryce. I'll hand it over to you.
Okay. All right, let me go ahead and share my screen here. Okay. Okay. So hopefully everybody can hear me. and see the slides that are up on the screen there. If not, please do let me know. Hold on one second. Let me just. Okay. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. Let me try. Give me actually one moment. I need to find the. Okay. Sorry about the delay, everybody. I just wanted to make sure I have everything figured out here. Looks like we should be good. So I'm just going to go ahead and get started. I know we have a limited time, so I'm going to try to cover a lot of information about financial aid, for international students in the U.S. Or interested in going to the school in the U.S. We'll have questions at the end, so if you have those, please, put them into the chat. I'm happy to answer those towards the end if we have time. And I'm sure we'll make some time. We only have about 40 minutes for this presentation, and I want to thank friends at Education USA there for putting this together. And hosting the webinar and inviting me to come and talk. And I've given this talk before a few different times. And as Sarah mentioned, I Denison oversee the admission and financial aid for any international students, including students from the UK interested in applying to Denison. So just a few things that I want to cover. Terminology-wise, again, financial aid is a huge topic. So there's quite a lot, and everyone's going to come at this with different levels, I think, of knowledge and experience. So in this presentation, I try to just kind of cover the introductory level knowledge and information about financial aid, and hopefully you'll be able to pick something up, maybe new, or confirm what you've already learned as we go along. But just some terminology that we'll cover today. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about these individually here. Just know that these terms are things you'll run into if you're interested in applying for financial aid at U.S. colleges and universities. Need-based financial aid, which is separate from merit scholarships, need-blind admission versus need-sensitive or need-aware admission, meeting full demonstrated need gapping, and admit deny. These are mostly financial aid related terms that you'll want to be aware of. And I'll cover as we go through. Aid models used by colleges. So just a few kind of different models and structures that colleges have for international applicants as it relates to financial aid. Something important to know if you're interested in applying to colleges in the US, some colleges do offer need-based financial aid to international students, some don't. Some offer merit scholarships to international students, some may or may not. So there's different types of funding available. Some of it's offered by the institution, some of it may be through outside organizations as well. But there's different types of funding that's going to be available based on the school that you're applying to. So good to be aware of that. There's not really a uniform system of funding in the U.S. As a non-U.S. citizen or permanent resident, which most international students or most colleges define an international student as a non-U.S. citizen or permanent resident. And the main distinction in that is because of the funding that's available for those different groups of students, whether you're a U.S. citizen or not, kind of dictates what potential funding might be available for you. And for example, non-U.S. citizens are not eligible for federally funded loans, grants, things like that, right? So you'd be more limited in terms of what you could potentially qualify for government funding, obviously within the U.S. So domestic students do have that those opportunities available for federal loans and grants and things like that. Obviously, international students typically do not, unless you have some funding available through maybe a home government or an outside scholarship or home kind of financial institution, maybe a bank or another lender that's willing to give loans for student loans. But that's a distinction, right? That international students typically have a different process to qualify for financial aid and scholarships and what's available for them from college to college at different universities in the U.S. And colleges in the U.S. have different models that they will use to fund international students, right? And these are the main three that are listed here on the screen. And I'll kind of explain them here really quickly because these are important to understand as kind of how colleges build financial aid and scholarships for international students. The first there is listed as need blind and meeting full demonstrated need. So whenever you hear the term need blind, what that means is that the college or university does not consider your ability to contribute financially towards educational expenses in their admission decision or process. So, blind meaning that you don't see it or you don't consider it, right? So in need in this context, meaning financial need, your individual financial need as a student, right? And need can be different from student to student and oftentimes is different from student to student because need is on a spectrum, it's a continuum, right? Everyone has different levels of financial resources. And so therefore your need as an individual student is going to be different. But need blind, so not considering your ability to pay in the admission or selection or review process. And then meeting full demonstrated need is another term you'll commonly hear. So meeting full demonstrated need means that the college or university, if you're offered admission, will meet your demonstrated need through college-funded grants, scholarships, loans, possibly work-study awards. But meeting full demonstrated need, in theory, should mean that you would be able to afford it given your individual need, right? So they don't gap you, essentially. They don't leave a financial gap for you to figure out what to do with and to come up with in order to afford the cost of attendance. So the first example there being need blind and meeting full demonstrated need means that a college wouldn't consider your ability to pay and they would meet all of your demonstrated need through the admission process if you're offered admission. And that's rare for international students to find a college that kind of is both need blind and meets full demonstrated need. There are only a handful of colleges in the entire US that have that model for international students. So that is more rare, right? And those schools tend to be very selective because if you're in a situation where you're need blind, they're not considering your ability to pay and they're meeting your need. If you're admitted, that's a select few colleges. That's a model you don't see across the board. The second there is need sensitive and meeting full need, right? And Denison, this is kind of where we fall in terms of our aid model for international students. Need sensitive or need aware, which simply means that they do or they may consider your ability to contribute financially in the admission and funding process. So that's the contrast to need blind, right? So need aware versus need blind, those two are kind of in opposition to each other. So need sensitive or need aware, meeting full demonstrated need could be another model. The third being need blind, but not meeting full demonstrated need, so gapping. And there are many schools that do this, right? They'll admit you, based on your ability or the quality as an applicant, but then they may only offer you a partial scholarship, and then you would be expected to come up with the difference to kind of pay for that cost of attendance. And that's called gapping, right? There's a gap between what they're willing to offer you and what you're able to pay relative to the cost of attendance. So just something to keep in mind, there are different variations of these types of models that colleges use for financial aid. Some colleges only offer need-based financial aid and don't offer any scholarships. Some colleges don't offer any need-based aid, right? So they only offer merit scholarships, and it may be a range from $5,000 to $10,000, $20,000 or $30,000 a year, or a combination of need and merit-based or neither, right? So there really is a spectrum of different types of schools, and there are 4,500 colleges and universities across the U.S. So there's so many different schools, and it's very decentralized, just generally speaking. So there's not uniform rules that govern all colleges and universities as it relates to financial aid and scholarships, right? So you can see a lot of these different types of models, but this is a fair thing to keep in mind. I mean, if need is a big factor for you, if you know that you're not going to be able to afford the cost of attendance to attend college in the United States, there's a lot of advice I could give you, but certainly building a list of schools that meet your need, or have the ability to meet your demonstrated need, or offer some merit scholarships, or offer funding, or potentially it's just a lower cost to begin with, like community colleges or some other type of institution, something to certainly keep in mind as you build your list, as you start your college search. Just some data to keep in mind about the rates of awards. Some good things to know. Most international students in the U.S. are contributing, I would say, a majority of their cost themselves, or through family, or through outside sponsorships, or something else other than institutional aid. And you can see that this data is a few years old now, but I think it relatively is consistent in that fewer than 1 in 5 undergraduate international students receive some form of institutional aid. That may be different at the graduate level and everything, but just something to be aware of, that generally speaking, in the U.S., colleges kind of view it as the student's responsibility to be able to afford the cost, of attendance. And certainly there are things that many colleges can do, like Denison, like many others, to help you kind of meet your need, to help, offer you scholarships and things to reduce the financial burden. But just something to be aware of. It can be more selective if you have higher need, especially in a need-sensitive or need-aware admission environment. And it tends to be competitive for the funding, for international students, and that goes, for most students, when they're applying. But nonetheless, just to kind of set expectations, it can be more competitive the higher your needs to receive an offer of admission and funding that meets your need. And this is just another graphic that kind of shows you where the majority of funding sources for international students in the United States comes from. So just a breakdown of kind of where typically people are finding their money to contribute to be able to afford the cost of attendance. And obviously, there are a lot of international students in the U.S. There's over 1 million students currently enrolled across undergraduate, graduate, and pre-K through 12th grade educational levels in the U.S. So there's quite a variety of funding sources that you get, because it's such a broad set of students that we're talking about. But nonetheless, hopefully that's a helpful kind of glimpse into how most people kind of pay for their college expenses. All right, so here we're going to focus on need-based aid, and we'll talk a little bit more about merit scholarships in a minute. But this is really, I think, something that can be complicated. There's a lot of misunderstanding about kind of how it works, and not just for international students, for students here in the U.S. too. Quite frankly, it can be a complicated process. So kind of walk through this. Again, I do all the financial aid kind of initial review and packaging of our international students. So I have quite a bit of experience in this particular area. But need-based financial aid is just that, right? It's money that's set aside for admitted or current continuing students at the institution that is based on someone's individual need, their individual financial need. As I mentioned earlier, need is going to be different for everybody. So this is going to look different for every student based on your circumstances. But need is something that is calculated, when students apply to a college or university in the U.S., they can decide whether or not they want to apply for need-based aid. You don't have to apply for need-based aid, but it's an option most colleges and universities offer you. Again, as an international applicant, not as many schools are going to offer need-based aid to international students. Some limit it only to U.S. citizens or permanent residents. There might be different rules depending on the college, but many schools don't offer a need-based aid, and those that do tend to be private nonprofit colleges and universities in the U.S. I think on the former screen here you can see that 37% of the aid that went to international students in the U.S. was given to was at private nonprofit institutions in the U.S. So the majority of aid that international students are receiving are at private nonprofit colleges and universities. So a few terms to understand in kind of the need-based financial aid process. One is what's called the EFC, and that's the expected financial contribution. That is basically that's your need, or what the college university would expect you individually to contribute each year towards educational expenses. The expected financial, essentially the expected annual financial or family contribution. And then we'll cover different forms and applications and things needed for need-based aid. But I wanted to touch on what the EFC itself means. And now let's walk through how we kind of create an EFC for each applicant if they're applying for financial aid. And this is pretty standard across the board, no matter where you're applying, and how we determine someone's individual need. So when we determine need, so the EFC, like I said, is your expected contribution. The EFC is derived or created from a financial aid application. So as an international applicant, you would have to complete typically like an international student financial aid application or a CSS profile. Some institutions may have their own financial aid application, but generally speaking, if you're applying for financial aid, you have to show what you're able to contribute by filling out a financial aid application. That's how you establish what's called an expected family contribution or expected financial contribution. It's different based on the financial aid application, right? So your CSS profile may create a different EFC than, say, an international student financial aid application or something, because they're different applications. They ask different questions. They use different methodology in order to calculate someone's expected financial contribution based on the application. So, but just know that the EFC is created when you complete a financial aid application. To determine an individual student's need, right, demonstrated need, we take the cost of attendance, this is the formula on the first bullet there, the cost of attendance, and subtract someone's expected financial contribution to create their need, right? The remaining balance is someone's level of need. So at Denison, being a very elite, prestigious, nice liberal arts, residential liberal arts and sciences college, our cost of attendance is a bit higher than you would see at other schools. So just for an example, the cost of attendance at Denison, which includes tuition, fees, room, and board, is a total of about $67,000, or will be for the 2019-2020 school year. So if you're looking at, just for the simplicity of the example, $67,000, let's say someone has a EFC of $20,000, that would mean they have $47,000 of need, right? So you're taking the cost of attendance, subtracting their contribution, and creating your remaining need. Important to note in this formula that it's very much dependent, your need is very much dependent on the cost of attendance, right? So if it's only $30,000 to attend another school and your expected contribution is $20,000, that means your need is only $10,000, right, for that school, your remaining need. So your need can be different per school because the cost of attendance is different from school to school. And it's important to note too that cost of attendance, that definition can vary from school to school, right? So at Denison, when we talk about cost of attendance, we really only package students based on the direct costs of attending the college. So tuition, fees, housing, and food, essentially, right? We don't consider things like books and supplies, transportation to campus, other personal expenses in that cost. So just something to be aware of, different colleges will define the cost of attendance in different ways. I think typically at a minimum, what you see for cost of attendance is tuition, fees, like activity fees, health center fees, things like that, room and board or housing and food. That typically forms the core cost of attendance, but there are hidden costs and things that some colleges will include in their need calculation and others may not. Just different, how different colleges operate. But understanding generally how that formula works, where you take the cost of attendance, subtract your expected family contribution, creates your demonstrated need at the end, and that remaining balance. So as I kind of mentioned earlier, hold on one second. Okay. As I mentioned earlier, there are a variety of need-based financial aid applications that you'll have to complete. Typically, you have to complete these concurrently with your application for admission to an institution. So this is something you would complete in the admission process or the application process for admission. Different colleges have different requirements. These are some common ones that you'll see: the International Student Financial Aid application, which is a free paper-based application created by the College Board, which is the same organization that administers the SAT. Also administered by the College Board is what's called the CSS Profile. It's an online application that does include a fee. It's a small fee of, I think, $25 for your first, $16 for each college you want to send it to after your first sending school, I believe. So there's a fee associated with that one. The CSS Profile definitely is the most comprehensive that is out there. It's the most holistic financial aid application. And then some other need-based financial aid applications, the FAFSA, but that's only for U.S. citizens or permanent residents. So if you are a U.S. citizen or permanent resident, you're typically required to fill out a FAFSA if you're applying for financial aid. So you just got to check with the individual schools that you're interested in applying to, what they expect, which applications they require, what supporting documents, and things like that they require as well. This is a picture of the International Student Financial Aid application. Just something to be aware of. This is a free paper-based. Schools may have different expectations about how you complete this. Obviously, you can contact the schools individually if you're completing this form to ask questions about what they expect or what the most appropriate response is or what they're looking for certain questions. But just something to be aware of. It usually is free. It's usually paper-based, and that you just fill it out by hand or online and submit it. Different schools may have different expectations for what types of documentation you would have to show, things like that. So just something to be aware of. That's a common financial aid application. This is a kind of a snapshot of the CSS Profile application that you can find online. This typically has to be completed and submitted online. The CSS Profile, again, I mentioned earlier, it's a holistic, kind of a more holistic approach to measuring someone's need, especially compared to the FAFSA, which tends to be more simplistic in its overall kind of analysis of someone's financial need. So again, this is becoming more common. I think you're seeing more schools adopt the CSS Profile. So this is probably something you would run into. As far as I know, I think this tends to be more for undergraduate students applying for financial aid, but it could be for graduate as well. In my job, just do kind of undergraduate student admission, so I'm not as familiar with that process for the graduate student kind of aid process. But just something to be aware of, that CSS Profile is pretty common. Certification of finances is another application that you could see. At Denison, we don't require this from need-based aid applicants. We'll only require this from students not seeking need-based aid. So again, it might vary by school. All right, so to quickly talk about scholarships, and I think it's important to talk about this because scholarships are different than need-based financial aid, right? Need-based financial aid is very much a formula based on your demonstrated need, the cost of attendance at the school, and how you can fill that gap. So it's much more of a science, right? It's a formula that's based on concrete data and information about your individual financial circumstances. And typically schools have funds that are reserved specifically for need-based aid. The scholarships are different. Scholarships are merit-based, right? So in many ways, it's more of an art form than it is a science in that it's typically holistic. There's different considerations. There can be range of awards, but awards given for different reasons. Whereas financial aid is really just something that's offered to help students who need the money, right? Who have demonstrated that they need the money in order to afford college. And as I mentioned earlier, there are some schools who only offer need-based aid, right? And they don't offer merit scholarships to international students. There are some who only offer scholarships and not need-based aid, or a blend of the two. So just something to be aware of there. Now, if you're interested, just some information about scholarships that's up on the screen there. Again, they tend to be merit-based. some are academically focused, some have certain threshold criteria, like if you have a certain grade point average or achieve a certain score in an SAT or an ACT, then you automatically get this type of award. So there's really every shape, size, color, type of scholarship that you'll see. Some are for special talents, like if you can get an athletic scholarship or an art scholarship, or some are for specific populations. You know, if you're from a low-income school district or something like that, there may be specific scholarships, and there might be partnerships or affiliations with certain community-based organizations that colleges work with, things like that. Typically, colleges will list the scholarships that they have available. You'll be able to see, what's available, what you might qualify for in your particular situation. If like at Denison, for example, we have scholarships that are specifically for Columbus City school students. Obviously, as a student applying from the UK or another country or another city, wouldn't be eligible for that. So, but you can typically look through what's available, get a sense of what you may qualify for. In terms of scholarships, or maybe what you want to try to receive, in the admission process. The process will vary by school. So again, those kind of emphasize the importance of building a list of schools and really doing your research on those schools in terms of what scholarships they offer, what the requirements are for those, and financial aid policies. For any school that you're looking at, they may have a separate application that you have to complete for scholarships, or you may automatically be considered for scholarships when you apply. I know when you apply to Denison, if you apply to our college, on our member page of the Common Application, we ask you have to actively opt in to be considered for merit scholarships. So it underscores the importance of just reading through the instructions, reading through the application, making sure that you as an applicant are doing what you need to be doing to be considered for everything that is out there. So make sure you read through that carefully. Make sure if that's not clear, you ask questions of the college you're applying to. You can always ask questions about what's the average scholarship, or what's available, or what criteria are there, or what can I do to be more competitive for funding, whether it's a financial aid or a scholarship. And you can ask about their kind of what I alluded to earlier about their aid models and scholarship models that they use. You can ask if they're need blind or need aware. Those are all questions that an enlightened, I think, applicant or someone who's done some research in the process will ask if it's not clear, right? So you definitely want to make sure, and this is a big part. Like I see all the time where there's a definite misunderstanding or lack of understanding or full comprehension of how this works, for incoming students. And understandably so, it's confusing, but the funding and financing part is really important, because you have to be able to set yourself up for financial success for the duration of a program over the course of 4 years. So you want to make sure you understand kind of what's available, what scholarships you can qualify for. Typically, when schools will offer you an admission decision, they'll also release a financial aid and scholarship decision at the same time. So you get a good sense of, what exactly is expected. But just wanted to point that out to you in terms of scholarships. It's going to vary, but many international students can qualify for merit scholarships and receive them as well. So keep that in mind. And there's a distinction between those two, typically between scholarships and need-based financial aid. Just something to note on external scholarships. So this screen here is more specific to institutionally funded scholarships, right? Like scholarships that are funded by the college or university that you're applying to, that are being offered to you as an applicant or student. There are external scholarships someone could apply for if you're interested. If you're being gapped in your finances, or you need to come up with some extra spending money or something like that. There are opportunities out there that you could research. I would just say on this note that you should never pay to apply for a scholarship. So just be wary as you're looking through. There are a lot of external scholarship programs out there. You could spend a lot of time applying, going through this process, writing essays, for what may be a more challenging or competitive and time-consuming kind of opportunity. So just be aware of that. There's a great resource, fundingusstudy.org. I'm sure the Education USA offices and everybody would be happy to, kind of give you their advice and their wisdom on what's available to you specifically in your country or your community, in this regard. But just something to be aware of. I mean, you are your best advocate, as a student to try to help, kind of the financial side of it work out, right? So if you don't ask the questions, if you don't do the research, I don't think anyone's just going to hand you money, right? So this is kind of in that spirit, something that I always recommend as a way to kind of, or something just be aware of, right, as a possibility in the process. Although these do tend to be limited, I don't see a lot of money coming in from external scholarships from international students to Denison. But it certainly is possible. They do exist. So definitely something to explore. Just a few notes on some unseen costs. Now, it's expensive to study in the United States. Hopefully that's not a surprise, I think, to most of you. That's the reality, I think. And it's expensive, regardless, to live in the United States and just live, right? And then let alone the costs of food and housing and your personal expenses and, everything else that kind of is associated with just the cost of living, right? It is going to add up. And then add on top of that, you're in a 4-year program, there's going to be tuition, fees, housing, food, and then all those other kind of indirect or personal expenses on top of that. So it's expensive, especially considering that's a 4-year program for an undergraduate degree. In some cases for graduate, it might be 2, 3, 4 years as well. So it is important to plan appropriately for the duration of your program when you're thinking about finances, right? And there are some unseen costs to be aware of, things that can be a surprise, but are important to know when building your budget. If you need to get a passport, you're going to need to apply for a US visa. Those things cost money. Unfortunately, those are one-time fees typically, but just something to be aware of. You do have to pay a visa fee. You do have to pay a fee for SEVIS, which is the Secure and Exchange Visitor Information System. It's a U.S. side program that we use to kind of build international students that are studying in the U.S. and track them during their program. But those are fees that you may not know about, right? So just something to keep in mind. If you need to pay fees for like the SAT or ACT or a GRE or GMAT or something like that, you have to keep that in mind. Health insurance, most universities and colleges in the U.S. require students to show proof of health insurance. Most colleges and universities offer health insurance, but that's another cost that you have to pay on top of that potentially. If you have to get immunizations, inoculations, health screenings, things like that before you come, there may be fees associated with those. So just some things to keep in mind. You have to kind of get a holistic idea of your budget and the costs in order to really set yourself up, I think, to be successful financially. Most students, when they come to the U.S., should have access to some emergency funding. If something were to happen, just to have some funds immediately accessible that you can draw on. If you need to buy a flight or you need emergency medical bills or something like that to be covered for. Application fees of applying to schools in the U.S., books and supplies. Those are things that can vary by student, but just something to keep in mind when building a budget. A few notes on kind of the ethics of applying for financial aid through the process. Now, we do keep everything confidential and private. We don't share financial need information with anybody other than the student themselves. So we do a lot to maintain the security of all that data. It's very important to us. Similarly, as we expect the applicants to be honest in the representation of their finances, it's very important to be honest, straightforward in your financial kind of applications, your dealings with the college, because so much is relied on the integrity of the information that you're providing. And sometimes in some cases that's self-reported information, right? So it's important to be honest and a consistent representation of your financial health and wellness and what resources you have available. And if you haven't already, and if you're looking at an undergraduate program in the US or regardless, I mean, if you're interested in graduate school or really anything, is to have a serious conversation and have an intentional process by which you plan your budget. All right, and if that means including your parents in that conversation, including any other financial sponsors, whether it be extended family, friends, whatever is out there, to really have an honest, candid conversation about what could be contributed towards educational expenses, how you're going to make this financially work, and not to delay that process, not to assume that it'll work out, that all you need to do is get admission and then the rest will fall into place. That's not necessarily the case. And there have been situations in which we have to rescind admission, or our student has to drop out simply because they didn't budget appropriately and they no longer have funding, that they need maybe in their second or third or fourth year. And that's devastating, obviously, for the student, but also for the college. Our goal is to enroll students and have them graduate. And we don't want, most schools don't want finances to be a reason that you have to drop out early or transfer or not enroll. So it's an important part. It's kind of a necessary evil of the process, so to say, and that if you're not set up with an appropriate budget, you're not set up, if you haven't had an honest assessment of your financial capacity and conversation with those that are helping you along the way, it could really be doing yourself a disservice in the long run. So important to kind of think that through early on, as it will be really important that you have that planned out. And don't be afraid to ask for help with understanding the process if you have questions. I think we understand on our side that the process, is a bit complicated, and it's okay to ask questions. It's okay to be confused. Just ask questions if you ever, need help and understanding deeper. It's better to understand and know in certain terms than to just assume something is what you think it is, right? So, and then last, some things to keep in mind. I kind of mentioned this, developing a plan, thinking critically about what you were able to afford. And then, if that's a really important factor for you, using that component factor as a feature in your search, right, and building your college list. And I'm sure EduSA can provide resources on maybe which schools would be a good financial fit based on what you may be interested in. But just something to keep in mind. And again, as I mentioned earlier, financing is primarily the student's responsibility. The colleges, I think, do what we can to help students meet their need, to offer scholarships, to extend ourselves to make it a possibility financially. But at the end of the day, the bill is the responsibility of the student, and you need to make sure that you are able to meet your commitment financially. Again, kind of talking about aid models, differences there. A school that meets 100% of your demonstrated need may not be need blind, right? They may be need aware but meet your need. Or they may be need blind but not meeting your need as demonstrated through one of those financial aid applications. Don't apply to schools that aren't going to be a good financial fit. And for that matter, I wouldn't apply to schools in which you wouldn't accept an offer in any scenario if it wasn't made to you, right? I think the pervasiveness of online technology, it's easier to apply to multiple schools. Some schools don't even require an application fee, right? Things like that. So you may be tempted to apply to as many schools as you can and see what they say and see what the offer looks like. But, if need is a driving factor for you in your search, just know that, there are going to be some schools who will be financially out of reach for you. And it may not make as much sense to put them on your list or really seriously consider them, only to get your hopes up and then potentially be let down at the end of the day. If either they make you an offer that you can't afford, or you're not offered, at all. Or if you're receiving an offer and wouldn't attend that school in the first place, certainly probably not the best idea to apply there at all then. Also, one thing to note, and I didn't mention this will kind of be something I leave on, is financial aid awards. There's an increase in cost of attendance typically at colleges. I talked a lot about the cost of attendance. That can go up incrementally from year to year, typically at a rate of inflation. So you're looking at about 2 to maybe 4 or 5% per year. That is something to be aware of as well. The cost may increase as you move through your program. And in most cases it does. So, and usually it's nominal, maybe $1,000, $2,000 a year total increase on the cost. At a school like Denison, we actually, for students that apply for and receive financial aid, we increase their grant to offset the increase in cost. But that is something to be aware of. Some schools don't do that, right? So your need gets bigger potentially because the cost goes up, but your award may be fixed. And that kind of goes back to the point of just making sure if you receive an offer of admission, you understand the terms of the award. If you received one, a grant, scholarship, what do I need to keep receiving those? How does this look in subsequent years after the first year? What's my out-of-pocket going to be? And what are other incidental or indirect costs that I have to account for or budget for as well? Okay. So that's all I had for this presentation. I think that was hopefully right on time. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and pass it over.
Okay, thank you so much, Bryce. There was a lot of very useful and helpful information in your presentation. So yeah, like Bryce mentioned, we're going to move forward with just a short Q&A. So there is a little Q&A box that you can enter in your questions. We do ask that you refrain from very specific questions. So try to ask things that could be helpful for the whole group to hear. If you do have those kind of niche questions specific to your situation, we do have an advising inbox and a helpline, which is open Tuesdays and Thursdays from 1:30 to 4:30. So that's a resource to you if you need to ask those niche questions there, and the contact details are on our website. So let me see here. So I'll just filter some questions. Okay, so one question, if you are a US citizen and an international student, does that leave all options for financial aid open?
So, well, so for most colleges, right? So if you're a U.S. citizen, let's say you're a U.S. citizen, you're living in the U.K. and attending high school in the U.K. For most colleges in the U.S., if you're applying to schools in the U.S., they'll consider you a domestic applicant for financial aid, and mostly for financial aid purposes, right? So it could be different depending on the school you're applying to, but in most cases, that means that you would have to fill a FAFSA, or free application for federal student aid. And depending on the individual school, there might be separate requirements for a U.S. citizen versus a non-U.S. citizen, depending on which financial aid or what you're applying for financial aid wise. And I can use my school as an example again. There may be different models of financial aid depending on whether or not you're a U.S. citizen or not. So for example, at Denison, for U.S. citizens that apply, we have a model that's need blind and meets full demonstrated need. For non-U.S. citizens, we have a model that is need sensitive and meets full demonstrated need, right? So the distinction is important in that, you need blind or need sensitive process there. But we also have different ways that we build packages because domestic students are eligible for federal student loans, federal grants, right, for low income, or for example. So there's more tools that we use to build a financial aid package for domestic students. So in that way, we would treat you like a domestic applicant because you entered that financial aid process. Otherwise, the admission process is similar, for a domestic student or an international applicant to our college in that way. But we would have different models of financial aid depending on which kind of category you would fall into, a domestic or international student. That may be a bit different. For our domestic applicants for financial aid here at Denison, they have to fill out a FAFSA and a CSS profile. For international applicants, because they're not eligible for the FAFSA, they just have to file the profile. So it might be different for school how they classify, an international versus a domestic applicant, and what types of financial aid kind of applications they would require based on that. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Okay, another question. If you apply for need-based financial aid, can you still be considered for merit scholarships in your application?
Typically, yes. So if you apply for financial aid, and most schools I've seen, if they offer merit scholarships in addition to financial aid, again, there are some schools that only offer need-based aid, right? So whether or not you're applying for aid. That's really all that's available. Some schools that do offer both certainly could offer both, to an applicant. It could be a blend. You could get some need-based aid and some in a merit scholarship. And also there have been cases like at Denison where someone applies for need-based financial aid, for example, and let's say hypothetically they have, a moderate amount of need, right? They can contribute maybe half the cost. And we were going to offer that student a scholarship for some other reason anyway. That scholarship could, in theory, then meet their financial need, right? So you might have different types of packaging where you see some awards displacing other awards, right? Like, so in that scenario, you have financial need, but we're meeting that need with a merit scholarship, or we're meeting that need with a need-based grant. It depends on the school. I think most schools that offer financial aid will probably also offer some sort of merit scholarship. You may see those awards stack. You may get a merit scholarship and a need-based grant. You may see one displacing the other. It just depends on the school's model, and how they approach it. But I would say most will probably that do offer aid, probably offer some form of merit scholarship as well, on top of that.
Great. We've had a few questions come in about postgraduate funding. I'll just mention, this was more targeted for the undergraduate situation, but we do have resources on our Fulbright website about how funding works on the postgraduate level. So I thought another good question, what resource can you use to find out details about a college's financial aid systems and policies?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the best place to go first would be the college's website. Most colleges will have information about financial aid. Most should also have information specific to international applicants as well, if the policy is different for different groups. So that would be a good first place to go, because it should all be, you can imagine this is a frequently asked question of many financial aid and college admission offices, so it should be out there. Obviously, it's going to be different. You might see some different words being used or different amounts of information that's accessible. Some may opt to just provide less, or some may provide a lot of information. So you'll see differences there. But go to the website first, go to their financial aid and admission pages. Usually those two are closely located near each other, if not the same page. There should be information spelled out for different populations as it relates to financial aid. And if you can't find the information on the website, usually an email to a general admission or financial aid account, you could probably get that information pretty quickly. Again, because that's something that most colleges are answering and talking about a lot. So, but it should be out there on the websites, at least basically what their policies are.
That's helpful. We'll probably take just a couple more questions. So one came in, how long is the financial aid package meant to last for? Is it only for 1 year or the whole duration of the degree?
Yeah, that's a good question. And apologies if I didn't cover that in my initial presentation, because that's important, right? And most, and I would say all, should and probably do go for the duration of the program. For example, at Denison, when we admit somebody, we build a financial aid and scholarship package. It's for the duration of their program, so all 4 years. Each award is renewed each year. Each year you receive a new financial aid and scholarship package, but in most cases, merit scholarships tend to stay fixed for all 4 years. So like if you're offered a $20,000 merit scholarship when you're offered admission to the college, you can expect to receive that $20,000 each year for the duration of your program. Some have certain terms and conditions that you need to meet to continue receiving that award, like a minimum grade point average threshold or a certain type of expectation for you to, like if it's a community award, you might have to participate in X number of volunteer hours per semester or something along those lines. But usually the conditions to receive this scholarship and continue receiving that, if there are any, are communicated to the student. So that should be obvious or clear what the conditions are for that. Financial aid, similar to merit scholarships, is going to be something that you could expect to receive every year. In some cases, financial aid awards could go up as the cost of attendance increases or your need increases potentially from year to year. Those could fluctuate a bit in either direction as need changes again. So, but typically, you meet your need for all 4 years in most scenarios where you are receiving financial aid. So the awards tend to stay consistent throughout the program for all 4 years. And for example, at Denison, if we admit a student, we actually lock in their expected family contribution that they established when they applied for admission. So for example, if you applied to Denison, you fill out the CSS profile and your expected contribution was $20,000 a year, if you're admitted, we hold that constant for your 4 years. So you're never expected to pay more than $20,000 for the duration of your program for the cost of attendance. Different schools may have different policies on that regard specifically, but generally speaking, anything you receive in a financial aid and scholarship package is there for the duration of your program.
Perfect. Okay, I'm going to try to squeeze in, and I'm going to see if I can do a double question because I think they're both so good. I couldn't choose which one was better. So can you challenge the EFC as calculated by the college if you feel it's not correct? And what typically is the percentage of tuition you can get covered by financial aid packages?
Okay, so to answer the first question, can you challenge the EFC? That's going to be a college decision. It's going to vary by school. Typically, so you could have different EFCs, like your EFC from the FAFSA could be different from your EFC from the profile. And kind of what I said earlier, because they're different applications, they're asking different questions and trying to they take different views of your financial kind of resources and ability to contribute there. You can challenge the EFC in the sense that, let's say, college offers you admission and funding based on an EFC that you feel is inaccurate. You could potentially then appeal that award. Every college may have a different kind of policy around financial aid appeals. Some are going to be more strict and say, no, there's no appealing your EFC. It is what it is. That's what we do for everybody. And there's no appealing, right? And it's more straightforward. Some may, only consider appeals in extreme circumstances. Some may consider all appeals. And so it really is going to depend. I can say that, if you are a U.S. citizen and you're filling out a FAFSA, that federal methodology EFC that's created from the FAFSA, that's pretty fixed. That's going to be the same no matter which school you're applying to. So you could look at that EFC and say, well, I'm not willing to contribute that much, or I don't feel comfortable contributing that much. But generally speaking, the EFC should be a pretty accurate representation based on some hard data on what you could contribute. Of course, mistakes happen, right? Like you could accidentally incorrectly fill out the FAFSA or the CSS profile, in which case you probably need to correct those mistakes with those application administrators, which could impact your EFC. But generally, the FAFSA EFC is fixed. It's the same for every school. Your CSS profile, every college that accepts the CSS profile may have a different methodology for calculating your EFC based on your responses to the profile. So you don't actually know what the EFC is being calculated as at each of the colleges you're applying to via the CSS profile. So I see more appeals, so to say, of the EFC in CSS profile cases. And again, if you're offered admission, they're building your financial aid package based on your CSS profile. You think that, no, I can't actually contribute that much money based on my EFC from the profile. It's up to the college basically to decide whether or not they want to allow you to appeal, whether or not they want to allow you to change your EFC, or how that would work on an individual college level. But it really would be up to the individual school. I know anecdotally a lot of schools, in order to make it equitable for everybody, they sort of say, what, it is what it is. The EFC is, it's the same for everybody. We calculate for everybody, and our policy is that that's your need, right? And our minimum guarantees that we meet your need based on that information. So it's going to be a college to college thing. But certainly if you feel that you're in a situation where, hey, I got an offer of admission and funding and this EFC is unattainable for me, definitely, think that through. Think if you're going to appeal, have it well thought out, justified, supporting documentation, things like that would be needed, because you would have to typically show beyond, a doubt that you genuinely need this money. There was that EFC is too high or whatever that may be. And we could probably spend an entire session really talking about that. It's a good question. Like so many answers I feel like I do give in this regard, it's kind of up to the individual school to kind of make those decisions. But I do see many schools that do offer need-based financial aid to international students that don't necessarily accept or even consider appeals of the EFC. So just something to be aware of. But it's always okay to ask. But if you do ask, be careful that you don't say anything that isn't true, right? Honest representation of your finances is critically important. And you don't know what the college is seeing in terms of your responses to the financial aid questions to create the EFC. So just make sure that if you do appeal or if you do ask the question, that you're being truthful in that process as well. And then what was the second part? I'm sorry, I talked so long, I forgot I think there was a second.
Great. So the last one was, what typically is the percentage of tuition you can get covered by financial aid packages?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's going to vary significantly based on your individual need, because everyone's needs different, right? And based on your need kind of determines how much percentage of tuition you would need to receive in financial aid to be able to afford the cost of attendance. So, again, it's just many schools will offer 100% discount on tuition. If you're applying and you have $0 to contribute towards educational expenses and you're admitted and they meet your full need, then, conceivably, you could, for some schools that do have that policy or that model, you could receive a full tuition and room and board cost of attendance through a financial aid grant, essentially. So it could be as high as 100+% of the cost of tuition. But it really would be depending on your individual need. Now, I will say that in models for colleges that are need aware, right, like Denison is, generally speaking, it's a sliding scale of selectivity based on your need, right? So if you have very high need, although your need would be met if you're admitted, it might be very selective to be admitted in the first place. And there's many reasons for being need aware. I mean, you could have a limited financial aid budget. Your proportion of applicants could be needier than not, and you still have to generate tuition revenue, things like that. But, if you're applying for more financial aid, generally speaking, or if you're going to need more money, generally speaking, it will be more competitive and selective, because more often than not, schools that offer need-based aid to international applicants do tend to be need sensitive or need aware. As I mentioned kind of earlier, there are a handful of schools that are need blind and meet full need for international students. They tend to be more selective, generally speaking, regardless of that model. So the percentage of tuition is going to be based on your individual need. I mean, that's how financial aid works, right? Fundamentally. But in most scenarios where you are in a need aware context, it'll probably be more selective the more need you have, or the more need you demonstrate.
Great. Yeah, that's a lot of our advice as well. It depends on the student. It depends on the university. It just depends. But that's the beauty of the U.S. system, is it's the land of the free, which means there's a lot of opportunity, but also it just means a little bit more work and research on the end of the students. So that was amazing. Thank you so much, Bryce, for joining us. Thank you, everyone, for coming along and for your great questions as well. So this is the first of a series of webinars. So you can check our website for the next webinars that are coming up, including ones on sports scholarships, student visas, choosing a university. So do register for those if you're interested. And if you have further funding questions, if you're interested in Denison, I'm sure you can contact Bryce, and any funding questions specific to UK or your situation, you can always contact us as well. So thank you so much again, Bryce, and thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.